Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our theatre. It's nice to see some familiar faces out there and a few new faces as well. We've got a panel session now to talk about ports and infrastructure, both for decommissioning and eventually for the construction and maintenance, and eventually even for the decommissioning of offshore wind. So we've got four really interesting and quite different speakers here. We're going to start off though with the guy who's just completed a study for us looking at the suitability of different ports in Western Australia to support the decommissioning activities. That's Rudi Smith from Kent. So Rudi, if you'd like to come on up, and over to you, my friend.
Good afternoon all. Can you hear me at the back okay? Yep, perfect. So my name's Rudi Smith. I'm a Principal Structural Engineer with Kent Consultancy. So I'm one of the authors of the WA Decommissioning Hub study, which we authored on behalf of CODA. So it was released about 3 weeks ago in amongst the suite of other reports that we've got for CODA. So Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge quite a number of companies who we engaged with last year as we were authoring the study. All of these companies and organisations, government organisations on the screen, provided their time and insights, which we've done our best to collate into the report that's available via the partner portal or on the main website. And so really we've tried to distill down their insights and recommendations to publish for CODA and the wider industry. So in terms of the actual study, we went through a fairly structured process in Q2 last year to essentially, the first step, look through the demand side of what sort of volumes of offshore infrastructure could be coming ashore within WA. And once we'd quantified that, particularly using the CODA liability study and also the recycling pathway study that CODA had completed previously, to map that into some specifications for what would be required from the ports. With this, we developed a screening criteria and then basically went through each of the gazetted ports within the state and reviewed those against the screening criteria. Essentially, in Francis' words, we started with everything larger than a boat ramp and really got it down to 6 facilities where we did a fairly deep review of. At this stage, that's when we went out to the CODA partners that we saw on screen to understand, particularly nuances about both the locations and then also the activities that would be completed onshore. So from the study, I guess there were 6 key points, but I'll go through 2 of them today, which are particularly pertinent on the port aspect. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, the onshore decommissioning solution for WA, we view as needing multiple facilities to fit that gap. So particularly we looked at 2 different sorts of facilities. Firstly, what we consider a medium capacity facilities that can take the typical sort of assets that are coming ashore at the moment, things like your subsea infrastructure, your surf, perhaps some of the smaller wellhead platforms where they don't have particularly complex loading requirements. There aren't major upgrades to the ports required for that. Secondarily, we also identified a need for a large capacity facility which should be able to load in the heaviest of structures, the sort of facility that you see through Europe where you've got a skidded load-in of these sort of 10,000 tonne jackets, 20,000 tonne topsides all coming through together. So for us, we split it into those two areas with an immediate need for those medium capacity facilities and then separately from about 2030 a requirement for one of those large capacity facilities requiring heavy load-in of those huge structures. The other key point relevant for today is we saw considerable overlap in the overall specification that we needed for decommissioning as well as offshore wind. So from an offshore wind perspective, both the construction staging, but then also the subsequent decommissioning of those structures. In the crudest sense, essentially what you need for a decommissioning port is a fairly significant amount of quayside land, and basically for a staging port and a decommissioning port for offshore wind, you need the same. We've got further detail within the main report of what sort of specifications we believe are required for that, but certainly see strong alignment between those two specifications. Within the report, we concluded with 19 actionable recommendations to go back to state and federal governments and then also industry on really taken from where we are now to get it into a more mature market and enable the industry to really get humming. So the full 19 recommendations are in the report, but I want to cover 3 of those today, which are, again, most pertinent. The first one, which I guess we always bang on about, and certainly in the panel session yesterday on the circular economy, came down to regulatory guidelines or the regulations sort of being a key enabler for this to occur. I guess in the decommissioning space, both NOPSEMA and DEMIRS within the state have provided great regulatory guidance documents on the offshore aspects of the decommissioning supply chain, but really at the moment there's a little bit of a gap in terms of piecing together the onshore aspects. We've got existing regulations which are suitable for each individual sort of aspect of the onshore decommissioning, but really when we look at how that'll come ashore, either as a structure or the process that will go through for the onshore decommissioning, certainly some guidance to link it all together to enable essentially the projects to run as smoothly as possible and de-risk at least the regulatory aspect of the decom. For us, we'd certainly love to see some additional waste hierarchy expectations in terms of reuse, recycle versus dispose of. I've made the note below that other jurisdictions have fairly high degree of transparency for what's being done, and I think would certainly benefit in Australia if we had similar transparency around what sort of targeted percentages for recycling and reuse versus what's going to be disposed of. A specific aspect for this is with respect to the licensing of common user or multi-user facilities. Without going into too much detail, typically the operators of facilities hold the licences with the WER for the sort of decommissioning activities that are conducted with, but they're not the ones that are executing that work. So different ports and different port operators, different decommissioning contractors, they've gone with different arrangements to manage that risk. But certainly our engagement with the WER indicated there wasn't a set optimised way of doing this, and certainly standardisation across the industry for this aspect we'd again recommend there was some focus on, again, just to de-risk those projects. And the last one for today, which fits both in with the offshore wind perspective and also what we consider our larger decommissioning hub or port facility, is essentially we're looking in the southwest for the large capacity facility, basically either AMC or developing undeveloped land in Bunbury. For these sort of quayside port spaces, there's existing high demand from construction, defence, offshore wind, and then the additional cargoes associated with offshore oil and gas. So going forward, even today, there's capacity constraints there or high demand for them. So we'd see, rather than each individual industry getting together plans, really in this space we need a pan-industry integrated planning to look at what sort of demand that will be coming through these ports and how we can essentially smooth out that demand profile and really enable each of those key industries to be able to meet the schedules for the projects that are being proposed, and ensure that, from a state economy perspective, they start happening as soon as possible. So that's all I'll go through on the slides today. I've got 9 seconds left, so I'll be around afterwards if you'd like to chat. And then likewise, I've also got Paul's contact details on screen, who's our offshore wind man within Kent. Thanks very much for your attendance.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Rudi. A good scene setter in terms of just an understanding of what we've got and what we may need and where it all goes next. To get into the specifics of a couple of the ports, we've now got Jason Parsons from the AMC, Common User Facility, who's going to talk to us about essentially what's going on down there and what could go on down there. So over to you, please, Jason.
Thank you, Francis. So I've got quite a few slides, so I'm going to be moving through this pretty quick. If there's any questions, we'll add them in at the end. So I've titled our slide as providing the critical infrastructure for the state. So for context, the Australian Marine Complex Common User Facility sits at about 35 k's that way. We sit in the middle of one of the 5 precincts in the AMC. And on the northern side we have the Marine Precinct, and on the eastern side we have the Fabrication Precinct. Before I jump into what is more around the nuts and bolts of the capabilities, I need to explain our operating model. So the CUF, or the Common User Facility, is owned by the state government. We're governed by 2 departments, Development WA and JITSI, or Jobs, Tourism, Science and Industry. Development WA, I report to Development WA. I work for Ventia as the facility manager of the Common User Facility, and our job is to market, manage, maintain and operate some of those common user assets. And then the 4th tier, by no means the tier below, is the CUF users. It's important to understand that when the CUF users engage at the CUF, they are responsible for their projects. So effectively, we hand over an area for them, and they are responsible for those activities that occur within it. So Ventia doesn't do the work. We use, or we highlight what the capabilities can be done, and the projects come into us, and they're completed by the organisations by themselves. So probably into the next part is the CUF infrastructure. Sorry, can't see. So the CUF was built in 2003. It's evolved, it's been added to, it's developed since then, but it's always worked on the pretense of a deep water port. It has multiple wharves. You can see the wharves 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to 6. Each of those wharves have different capacities. So we've got deck and pile, we've got land back, we've got row capabilities, we've got load in, load out capabilities provided for those wharves. About 30 hectares of laydown area. Rudi mentioned that's pretty important. The other key parts to it is that we have access to the state's high wide load network. So oversized goods, materials can come in and out. And then right in the middle of it, we have a floating dock that's capable of lifting 12,000 tonnes, and combined with that is some self-propelled modular transporters, or SPMTs, and they're capable of moving 4,500 tonnes. So it's the combination of those assets and how they can be used, and how can they be used for decommissioning and or wind farms. So of the 20-odd decommissioning projects that have been done in the last decade, we've chosen 4 as an example of what can be done. And again, we didn't do them, but we worked with the companies to show what could be done and how those assets could be used for the different projects. And we've chosen one example, the wind farm, to show what that actually means and size-wise. So the first project is the riser turret mooring decommissioning. This has used a barge. You can see the turrets on the barge. The barge is in a Mediterranean moor. The self-propelled modular transporters went onto the barge. They lifted the mooring. They poured it onto land. They then moved it into position at the CUF. There was material put underneath to protect the surfaces so it's not damaged. and then basically the client went to work, and this was done by McMahon for Woodside. So you can see the different stages there, and then it's actually returned to, pretty much returned to as it was, and that facility is available now for someone else to use. The next project is a integrated project. So it was a heavy lift vessel. They had taken off some modules from Hay Point, which was being upgraded in Queensland. These modules were offloaded, just lifted directly from the ship onto the SPMTs, and the same process. Moved into position, where they were then decommissioned into smaller parts, processed, area returned back. Matter of fact, the same area that your previous project took up was in that same area where this project was done. The really interesting part about this project, apart from the decommissioning, is it was part of an integrated project. So there was a local fabricator had the wharf modules, those replacement wharf modules went back on that heavy lift ship to Queensland, and that process went back and forward, and eventually a ship loader which was produced in Henderson went back on that ship, and that was the last load. The next project, apologies to Mitch if I get this wrong, but this was the ex-HMAS Sirius. In short, too long, too heavy for our floating dock to lift. So it went on a bit of a weight reduction program, came along to AMC6, and they took off as much weight as could be done, and that material was then processed and sent out for processing. Still too big, still too heavy. Again, the vessel was put in the Mediterranean Moor at AMC6. As you can see, it was cut in half. The stern was then taken to the the bow was taken to the floating dock, lifted, transported by the SPMTs onto the land from the floating dock, taken into an area where it was decommissioned. Still left with half a ship. Repeat the process, bring it onto land, and go again. The next program, similar or slightly different, but similar, or same company actually, is that the ex-Otama. So the Otama was sitting in East Coast. It was brought over on a semi-submersible vessel. That semi-submersible vessel submerged at our wharf AMC4. It was then literally towed from the semi-submersible vessel to the floating dock, where that lift capacity was used again, transferred to the SPMTs, transferred from the floating dock to the SPMTs into the area it was finally decommissioned. So moving away from the decommissioning element is into wind farms. Now these are terrestrial wind farms. This is the Warradar and Yandin programs. For context, those blades are approximately 74 metres long. All of these had to go out through the state's high wide load network up to where they sit now. Approximately 900 components, 14 vessels. Just for context, that's only one or two ships cargo at the cuff at present, or at that time. And that was a real balancing act between the cargo that was being delivered and the space that was required versus the cargo that's going out. So it was that whole, do we have enough, how do we have enough? And things that were affecting that is things like traffic escorts, things like there might be a storm or a road issue, and that then slowed out the delivery because those loads could only at that time go out at night or on the weekends. Okay, so key takeaways from my perspective. You need an integrated infrastructure. It's the combination of all the different assets that can provide the solution. You can have a wharf, but it's a wharf. You need a wharf and laydown area. You need wharf, laydown area, and access to the high wide load. Is important. But just as important is the agile and flexible approach. It's the art of the possible. What can be done? What can be done with what we have now? What can be done with what we have now and the what if? What if we did this? What if we did that? Will that make it easier? And that's everything from the people that are planning the methodologies, even to the people that are decommissioning or deconstructing on ground. If you're the person on a gas axe doing a stitch cut, you want to make sure that thing's not going to fall on you. So those things, it's understanding what that is. So it's agile and flexible. The next two, the available and appropriate material disposals and logistics. So what comes in must go out. Whether it's either being received for dispatch or received for disposal, or on the opposite side, if it was something that was being constructed and then loaded out. And the last one, which is Rudi had already mentioned, is you need supportive regulatory and legislative frameworks. So at the common user facility, at any one time, you've got international, Commonwealth, state, and local government legislation going on at once. Everything from biosecurity, dewar, disposal, and a lot of those regulations may not necessarily be written for today's times. So you really have to dig into what was the intent of that legislation, what are they trying to control, what are they trying to achieve? And don't be frightened to ask a question. We had to work a lot with WorkSafe, particularly around when we first started decommissioning vessels, because if you looked into the decommissioning Australian standards, they didn't mention a vessel, didn't mention a ship. So it's really around the art of the possible. Ask if you can prove that the intent and how you're managing those risks are managed appropriately, are managed safely, are managed in an environmentally friendly way, more than likely they'll support you. That's all I've got.
Excellent, thank you very much, Jason, and got to applaud both of you for keeping so well on time as well, with so much material to get through. So moving on, another port, different size, different situation, very different location. So Andre Veder is going to talk to us about Onslow Marine Supply Base. Over to you, please, Andre.
Thank you, Francis, and thanks so much for CODA for putting these really important, informative sessions on for us to really learn and collaborate with each other, on this emerging industry, which is of state significance, if not national significance. So, in Onslow, we've been on a journey since 2014, and our journey started about creating common user port infrastructure on the fringe of the Pilbara region to be able to support the optimisation of supply chains. And if we can cast our mind back to 2014, this was a time pre-COVID, I'm thinking of a pop reference, but I can't come up with anything, but pre-lots of things, right? Decommissioning was a distant thought. We knew from state government engagement that there was this thing called the reverse supply chain from the Carnarvon Basin that we needed to think about. So when we designed our facility, we thought heavy lift, we need robust infrastructure, we need a lot of land at the quay, and if we get those components right, we should be able to accommodate almost anything that industries, not only decommissioning, but industries, throw at us over the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years. So in Onslow, we're really proud that we've created this infrastructure where it's not just about decommissioning, but it's about creating a common user experience where we could have container imports one day, decommissioned products the next, and then we can have offshore operational servicing on day 3. So in 2020 at the DNA conference, 2022 at the DNA conference in Perth, we launched a really interesting idea about creating the Onslow Decommissioning Hub. And then we conceptualised it as this thought that decommissioning from a landside perspective isn't just about having a great port facility. It's about having a supportive township and your host community being on point with you. It's about having a really good residential workforce, so you get that flexibility, but also having appropriately licensed and serviced land available to be able to support a litany of service providers that are required to get around decommissioning in order to make it a success. So we started that idea and we were successful in getting some early runs in 2022. In 2023, we continued to execute some campaigns and started to grow our workforce and our support base with various service providers. And very favourably, Francis and his team and Rudi and his team, we hoodwinked them into agreeing that Onslow should be named a decommissioning hub in Western Australia. And it's interesting because just down the road from our facility, we've got the Ashburton Port. And both of those facilities are named as, part of the decommissioning solution for WA, which is pretty exciting. But with these ports, the berth lines are actually 12 kilometres apart. So there'd be ports globally that are considered a single port that have facilities further away than 12 kilometres. So our vision in the Onslow context is Onslow has a really favourable geographical location when you think about the decommissioning liabilities over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So why don't we start to conceptualise Onslow as a decommissioning hub with both ports being able to draw on co-located service providers. And I wanted to talk you through a little bit about that journey, feature some of our facility points, and then run through what we consider in the port context, probably one of the most important pieces in the decommissioning story, and that's about the legislative or the regulatory construct, which a lot of people might not be completely across. So our facility that we created here is 31,000 square metres of hardstand on a quay that's 277 metres in length. So we have the ability to be able to tie multiple vessels up at the same time, discharge, we've got the ability for roll on, roll off, a whole range of features. And the unique thing for us is that the ability to be able to set up really heavy lift assets at the berth line and facilitate that transition from a barge to landside. But then also, we could actually process some of the decommissioning items in the port without it ever coming in contact with the public. So do you remember that 10-cent piece of radioactive material that dropped off? We don't talk about it much in WA anymore, but that came as a consequence of a rushed supply chain, right? And if you think about landing something that's been at the bottom of the ocean, and I speak to some of my oil and gas colleagues that created some of these wells, and they talk about all sorts of strange installations that they did that might not have been part of the ASCONs for the assets. So we're pulling them out 30 years after being on the ocean floor. We've got a good understanding about what's there, but the second it comes onto landside, it's not the time to rush. It's actually the time to take a breath, appreciate what you've got, and then once you're ready to push that further into the supply chain, to actually do it in the most sensible way. And I've explained it to people as, if you get a 100-metre steel beam and there's 1 metre of contaminants in it, you need to think about how you're going to transport that into the supply chain. And the way that we are able to support the industry is by giving you the time to realise that if you cut 2 metres on either side of that product, you now have a 5-metre bit of contaminated steel that needs to be appropriately addressed and then sent through the supply chain, and maybe end up at Tallis or somewhere else that's appropriate to dispose of. But then you have 95 metres worth of virgin steel that you can transport and reinsert into the supply chain in unique ways. So our facility is all about that and giving people that certainty and the reliability. Now just down the road, the Pilbara Ports Authority have the Port of Ashburton. Now we operate out of there as well, and we think this is a really strategic asset for the state. So our facility, we've really focused in on making sure licensing is available, and we've got a certain size of vessel that we can accommodate. At the Port of Ashburton, we can accommodate vessels up to 166 metres in length, if I remember correctly. And there is actually a reasonable amount of space at the Port of Ashburton, but it's a different port. It's a port that's been set up as a common user facility that doesn't have licensing at the quay. So when you land a potentially contaminated item, you will need to move it off the quay quickly. But you can see the idea that I put forward originally. What does it look like if Onslow becomes a decommissioning hub and has all these co-located service providers and bits of infrastructure that can be accessible from both ports? You can see great things happening, right? So now for the most boring bit of the entire conference by far is about, next slide, compliance. So one of our really interesting findings along this journey, and Francis is probably going to tell me off for talking too long a sec, but I'll try to avoid eye contact, has been about the decommissioning regulatory construct. So when you're bringing an asset on shore, it's not just about saying you're in a port, you can handle it, you can treat it. You need management plans, you need trained and qualified and experienced staff to be able to deal with contaminants of any sort. you need to be ready for the unexpected. So in Onslow, what we've done is we've established a regulatory framework that supports all classes of dangerous goods, has appropriate licences in place, whether it's from DMIRS, Department of Health, or DWER, to be able to support the idea that you're not just landing a product and then treating it as cargo until it's convenient for you, but you can actually categorise it at the quay and have it held there and treated there in a highly compliant way. Because the whole idea about trailing liability for the industry, there's a lot of focus about the offshore, but once you bring it onshore and the opportunity for contaminants and negative effects are still quite significant, and it needs to be treated in a really serious way at the quay as well. So when I talk to my colleagues about what 2025 looks like for us, it's about continuing this journey alongside our client base. And there are so many things that we've learnt in the last couple of days, and in the next year we'll continue to learn. Next year it might be no longer a focus on compliance because that's an industry standard. It might be a focus on different lifting or shifting capabilities. But being able to be flexible enough to be able to grow with the client base and the supplier base in Onslow to support the decommissioning industry in Western Australia. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much there, Andre. You only overrun by a minute. It'll be on your bill. Okay, so we've heard now a lot about the decommissioning side. We've heard some really, really interesting commentary about the ports. The other side of the use for all of this, of course, is how can we use these ports to build our potential offshore our offshore wind industry. And my apologies there, Joy. So I'd now like to invite Joy Francis Hayes from Copenhagen Energy to come along and talk to us about, I guess, the other side. They're using these facilities to build the big things that we expect to see in the next few years. Thank you, Joy.
Thanks, Francis, and the team at CODA for inviting me to be part of this. Can you hear me up at the back there, or not too much? Good question as to why I'm here today as part of a decommissioning panel, and it really comes down to ports. So there's significant potential partnerships, analogies that can be sought with these two very large industries, with decommissioning and also offshore wind, in the way and enabling port upgrades to enable these two industries. So just jump back a little bit. I'm the development manager for Copenhagen Energy, and for the past 4 years we've been developing 4 offshore wind farms here in Western Australia. And I'm just going to show you a little bit, give you a bit of a background on what we've been doing here. This is a map of the Geograph Bay region, and it might be a little difficult to see, but there's a red polygon there, and that's actually recently announced. Minister Bowen declared, or didn't declare the area, but announced an area for Bunbury. And in the coming months, there'll be an area of declared potentially if it's deemed suitable. The other polygons there are actually some of the study areas that we've been looking at, and the most advanced of our project is called the Lewin Offshore Wind Project. The smaller triangle is a nominal area, 700 square kilometres, which could be the size of a project. So we're going through a public consultation process, and so I urge everybody to be part of that, to have your say about this potentially new industry coming our way here in Western Australia. A little bit on the next steps. So an area potentially declared if deemed suitable within that red polygon area. Then there's a period of around 7 years of feasibility. So that's really to assess the technical, the financial, environmental and social feasibility of these projects. And that's all part of an approvals process as well. We have some of the best approval processes in the world. And that's to really deem, are these projects suitable for this area, and should they go ahead? So bottom line about that line is really it's still a long, long way to go. There's a lot of work to be done, significant survey works as part of that process, management plans, and then if deemed suitable, going through to commercial licences and potentially building something in the water around those areas around 2030, 32, 35. So we still have a long, long way to go, but ports are a really key element to this, and hence my contribution to this panel is what do we need to do to get the ports ready? There's significant synergies between these two big industries around ports. Ports are really key for offshore wind, and the reason being is that we have significantly large components. So what I've done here is included some photos of offshore wind components, and I've actually tried to put a person in there, but it's very difficult to see the person because they're so small. So over here is a nacelle on the left-hand side. There is a person there, but you can't actually see them. So these nacelles are 700 tonnes, so they're large. We're proposing a project of 200 turbines. So if you just imagine 200 of those 700-tonne nacelles stacked up on the dockside. The blades, this is a 15 megawatt blade, around about 150 metres long. So if we're having 200 turbines, that's 600 of those stacked up along the dockside. So these are large components. So we've got the monopile. The monopiles are 2,000 tonnes, and again, 200 of those on the dockside. The transition pieces, so that's the yellow pieces there, so they're around 500 tonnes, and again, 200 of those. There is a person there. You can see that person right there. So that will hopefully give you an understanding of just the scale here. The scale of these projects is large, so 200 turbines, large components, and that's where it becomes very significant in the ports. So we have some phenomenal ports here in Western Australia. There's some very key drivers around what those port upgrades may need to be. So the vessel access, so large components needing large vessels, channels ideally of 300 metres in widths and berth depths of 12 metres. Laydown areas, significantly large laydown areas of 30 to 40 hectares required, and deck ratings of 10 tonnes per metre squared. Ideally, those laydown areas would be quite close to where the ships are loading them on and off. Distance to site, that's another key critical factor for offshore wind, as we really need them to be quite close to where that construction happens. So anything less than 100 kilometres would be ideal. So again, we have some fantastic ports. We've seen the AMC, we've also got Southern Ports, Bunbury down in Southern Ports, phenomenal ports that are used to lifting and handling large components from the oil and gas and the mining sector. But they weren't designed for offshore wind, and there's some rather unique elements. But actually there's a fair bit of alignment with decommissioning in terms of tonnage, but the advantage with offshore wind is it's actually very repetitive. So the turbines, you've got 600, it's a repetitive movement. So whereas decommissioning, it's new every time. You've got new shapes and sizes and contamination factors there. So we have some phenomenal ports, and we've been talking with all the ports to work out what do we do, how do we do it, what's required to upgrade those ports. But it's not new. This has been done across the globe, and I just wanted to include a few examples here. So of ports that have actually facilitated decommissioning and offshore wind in the same spaces and at the same time as well. So Esbjerg Port is great. I went there last year. A wonderful port and a great example of a transitional port. So they started as a fishing port, became an offshore oil and gas port, and now 80% of offshore wind turbines go through the port of Esbjerg. They also do significant amounts of decommissioning at that port as well. So it's not new. There's a lot of lessons that can be learned from other countries and other jurisdictions, and how do we do that? And significant opportunities for these two big industries to enable those port upgrades to happen. The last point I wanted to make is port upgrades have significant impacts on those local communities surrounding those ports. There's a lot of evidence to show that when you have port upgrades, it leads to an increase in jobs, an increase in the skills of those people within those areas, and that has a significant impact on the local prosperity of those communities. So port upgrades are significant, and it's wonderful to see the state government looking at how do we enable that to happen with these two industries. But looking forward to the panel and any questions on offshore wind. That was rather fast. I maybe spoke too fast, Francis. I'll pass it over to you, though.
Thank you, Joy. Yes, you can take your credit from Andre for you running a bit briefly there. So we will throw to the floor for a few questions in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to open with a couple of questions for our speakers first. Rudi, if I can start with you. Now you've listened to Jason and, well, actually all three of the speakers there. What are your thoughts around the timing for the developments that we need now to accommodate both the decommissioning and the offshore wind? I mean, do we have enough time? When do we need to start moving in terms of these potential redevelopments and expansions for the facilities that we've got?
Thanks, Francis. So on the timing front, I mean, it's interesting. Saw Andre talk. They started their journey 2014 and developed the facility. And even if you look what they've got plans in the future, they're moving towards aligning themselves with the additional volumes that are coming ashore. Certainly, all of the quaysides in Australia are, at capacity or near capacity, and we're only getting ever increasing volumes coming through. Joy had the example of her 200 wind turbine farm, which, by my maths was in excess of 600,000 tonnes of equipment going through that port. And so really it's about making sure we've got the time now to assess that and work out, okay, after the seven-year feasibility licence, to make sure you've got a port that's capable of pulling that sort of volume of equipment through over that time frame. Similarly on the decom side, from about the 2030 time point within WA, we'll start considering those large structures coming ashore. So we're really at a time point now where we need to act for the larger facilities, and we're fortunate that for some of our sort of moderate capacity facilities, we had port operators already identify what needs to be done and are moving in that space.
So the time is now, eh?
Yesterday.
Oh, we should have done this yesterday then. Right, good stuff. Thank you very much. If I can call to the two chaps in the middle, I'll ask these questions of both of you, so feel free to take them in, whichever, fight over the microphone or whatever. So Jason, maybe if I want to, actually I will start with you rather than just leave it for a free-for-all and both of you avoid the question. Now that you've had a few decommissioning projects go through the facility, what have been the biggest challenges? What have been both your biggest learnings, and where do you think maybe the obstacles sit beyond what you spoke about in your presentation?
Part of the art of the possible. We've had to think differently. We've had to think sort of differently of what we would accept. Previously, the facility was really designed around the construction and fabrication of large-scale projects, but decommissioning is that in reverse. So when you get your head around that, you kind of go, okay, well, in order to deliver that, that's what the activities need to be done. I think the biggest learning that I had was working with different regulatory bodies to sort of understand what is allowed. I don't do the activities. The users do that under their own control, but I'm also responsible for the land and the custodianship. So if someone says we can do it this way, I really need to understand that yes, that can be done that way, and that's actually legal or allowed. So really having to lean in and ask some questions. Ask some questions of my assumptions of what could be done, but then go to those different regulatory bodies. And I remember a meeting with the Department of Health trying to get my head around, well, how do you manage norms? And that was difficult. But when he then engaged someone to write a paper around what's required, and that paper has been useful for myself, but also the people coming to the CUF around, when you come to the CUF, this is the expectation. Yes, you might be used to decommissioning, but it needs to be done in this manner.
Excellent. Andre, yeah, same question?
I've got a slightly different take on it, as long as I don't break the microphone. I think that ports can no longer be seen as almost taxi ranks that just vehicles or vessels turn up at, load or unload people or cargo and then go off on their merry way. In the decommissioning space, the port needs to be a fundamental part of the overall planning and solution. So I think about the challenges of managing an offshore campaign and the delays with weather and a whole litany of things. The port can't remain static. The port needs to actually adapt, evolve and flex to be able to support an efficient campaign. And then you get these modules that come on shore. If the port hasn't collaborated and actually meaningfully invested with your suppliers, then you're going to have a compromised outcome. You're going to have duplication, triplication of resourcing, of regulatory requirements, a whole range of things. So in the decommissioning space, I think more than any other industry, there is a requirement for complete integration. And the port isn't just an infrastructure play, it's a service play. And so we've treated it slightly different to my colleague over here. We've actually said that we need to understand the project parameters. We need to work alongside the offshore companies and the onshore companies to figure out how we're going to exploit the best possible outcome for the overall client. And just being a landlord and telling people how you should or should not comply with our licenses or the licenses you can secure, I think it's there's definitely a better way to do it, and an integrated way would be the way that I'd suggest.
Thank you. If you can keep the microphone, Andre, I've got another one for you. So at the start of your presentation, you talked about the workshop that you held during the DNA conference here back in 2022 around building a community, I guess, around what you were heading toward developing up there. How's that gone? How is the community coming together, a community of industry, if you like, coming together around supporting the work that you're doing in the port?
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces to this. So whenever you get in front of a crowd and you present what your idea is, you leave the time scale a little bit vague, right? So coming from infrastructure development, you go and speak very confidently that, we're going to develop the world's best port and all the rest of that stuff, and somebody goes, oh, when's first lift? And you're like, oh, sometime in 25, we'll come back to you. You usually talk about halves, H1 or H2, give yourself a 6-month band. It's probably the same thing with getting people to work together. Collaboration is a really, really difficult thing. In fact, I think a lot of people fabricate complication and competition when collaboration is on the table. And a lot of people aspire for scope sprawl before they've even specialised or secured their own patch. So to answer your question directly, there's two parts to it. Number one, in terms of the industry piece, it's an ongoing, everyday discussion. We speak to people, explain to people about our vision, our service model. Some people will buy into it, and we've had early adopters like our partners at Liberty have they've drunk the Kool-Aid. I don't know if they've jumped in and they've actually made it a richer experience because there's been this upfront push and pull, and we've sharpened it. In the coming months, we'll announce more companies that will be collaborating with us, and I think of the work we're doing with ASCO in the radiation safety space. That's another key initiative there. Next year at AOG, I'm confident that we'll be talking about more people that are coming in and collaborating across both ports. That's the industry side, so it's an ongoing piece. On the community front, that is something that we need to invest in, not by the day, it's by the minute, right? So these industries have effects, both positive and negative, and unless we're focused on exploiting the positive side of both the positive and the negative, we'll quickly lose our host community. And we're going through some stuff at the moment with some alignment with the local government, and that's a focus of ours to be able to get that right. But like a lot of things, you need to be confident, and you need to fight for what you know is right and what you know you can deliver. And I guess that's our approach with the Onslow Decommissioning Hub.
Very good, thank you very much. Joy, I'll finish with you, and then we'll throw to any questions coming from the floor. And it'll be a similar version to the question I asked Rudi, I guess. Timelines around upgrades. So you're talking about now 2032, was that right, essentially, for starting construction, give or take?
Yeah, I mean, it really does depend on the approvals system in terms of getting some real clarity around state and federal and how that bipartisan sort of whether or not we can get a bilateral kind of agreement and a process there. So, but yeah, 2032, yeah.
Yep. So, to the similar question to what I asked Rudi, do we have enough time now to get the ports that we need ready for the volume of work that we're going to have?
Yeah, so I've talked at length with a couple of the port guys about how long that may well take. We're talking 4 to 5 years to get the port upgrades required and the approvals associated with those. So it's possible, but we do need to get moving on that relatively fast. And I think that's why this panel and the discussions we've been having about when you have two big industries like decommissioning and an offshore wind all pushing for similar timelines, then hopefully we can enable those upgrades to happen at a faster pace that's required so that everything's in place. So talking additional berths, deepening berths, lay down areas being aggregate added and other sort of shoring up so that they can hold that large tonnage. So there's quite a bit to be done. But yeah, having those two industries pushing, I think, is certainly going to help. Yep.
Very good. Now, one final question. You've talked about your project. Are you, if you're successful, will it be only you, or will there be 2 or 3 others also trying to do 700 facilities? Sorry, was it 200 platforms all at once?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and ultimately I don't really know the answer to that, but there is an indication that several licences may well be granted in those areas, in that offshore area in Bunbury. So, it could be 4 proponents. We're not really sure of the scale of that yet. Will they all be as large as the project we're proposing? It's still a big question. That's why we need that 7 years of feasibility to understand what does that impact, how many turbines could that area sustain. Then we're talking grid upgrades and all of the other flow-on effects from these very, very large projects. I probably didn't get it across previously when I spoke up there, but these aren't small projects. They're $10 million projects. $10 billion projects, so they're sizable projects. Will have big impacts on regional centres, and ports are part of that. So yeah. So possibly more. Yep.
Interesting journey ahead. Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, so any questions from anybody out in the audience? Surely, after all that, there must be somebody that's got a question they'd like to ask. Oh, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for your talks today. Rudi, you saying that, and you as well, that the ports need to upgrade and sooner rather than later. I wonder with that, port expansions themselves need to go through a rigorous environmental approvals process. Have you factored that in as well? Because it's not just the offshore wind that needs to go through its feasibility study, but also the ports, the dredging, the expansion of the shipping. Has that been factored in as well?
I guess for us, in terms of the CODA port study, no, fundamentally no. In terms of what we believe the first step should be, is that strategic review of what's actually required. There's no point trying to push through developing a port to sustain a certain tonnage of decom cargoes plus 200 wind turbines when actually there's 2 or 3 proponents for an offshore wind farm, and there'll be 600 wind turbines coming through in a similar window. So for us, we believe that to be the first step, and again, needs to sort of happen yesterday because a port doesn't get built overnight, even if all the materials are available.
Yeah, it does raise an interesting question around who makes the decision as to which ports do what, and that's sort of being discussed at the state level at the moment as to which ports will sustain decommissioning, which ports will sustain offshore wind, and then we can understand what needs to be done at each of those ports, because the environmental considerations will be different for each of those ports. But 4 to 5 years is still a reasonable timeline for those upgrades, plus the environmental approvals as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, well done, thank you.
Hi, I'm an inspection engineer at Woodside, so it was wonderful to see the RTM horizontal and on land. And thank you for sharing the video of it being, the time lapse of it being pulled apart. It looked amazing. I'm just interested in what happened to it afterwards, what happened to all the bits, and how much of it was recycled, and where is it now? What's it doing now?
Sorry, that's a question I can't answer. You need to ask the person or the McMahons that undertook the works. So I do know a lot of it was in the initial meeting. So yes, we do get involved in a lot of our projects coming in. So we're involved in when, how long, what are you doing, and we do that for all of the facilities and all the different projects coming in. So in our initial discussions, a lot of it was going to be recycled, and the waste streams were identified, and in that time lapse you'll actually see certain kinds of waste streams being segregated and then sent out to different processing streams. But exactly where they ended up, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. Please go and see McMahon. I'm sure they'll tell you all about it.
Very good. And we can give you a contact in Woodside if you want to talk to them as well. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, David. Nope, microphone's on the way, mate.
I was just greeting Bill, but since you've
there you
asked
go.
a question,
That'll teach you.
I'll ask one. So we've heard a lot about the infrastructure, but the vessels that are required for the two types of services, for decom and for installation of the offshore wind, is there a possibility to use the same or similar vessels, and is there capacity for both types of vessels to be in these facilities at the same time?
And Rudi gets handed the microphone again.
So certainly a lot of the heavy lift facilities that are particularly up in Europe are dual use, and I'm sure some of the vessel operators or the people coming out of Europe would articulate how challenging and how constrained the vessel market is, and essentially whoever's got the deepest pockets will secure those vessels to come down. Obviously decommissioning, not much money there, and similarly a lot of the offshore wind doesn't necessarily have the same capital funding that maybe the big oil and gas projects have. Certainly there were comments yesterday regarding certain in Europe, certain operators seeing a softening in the demand for those vessels, but really there's good alignment between the two industries, and certainly that's where, again, get back to common specification across our port facilities to ensure that if we upgraded one for decommissioning, you'll be able to ensure offshore wind has the same or can operate out of that port as required.
Yeah, I agree with Rudi. It's all about collaboration. We're not really down at that level of detail at this point in time. We haven't booked any vessels. It is a restricted market in terms of number of vessels there at the moment, so even getting a booking in is going to be challenging prior to 2030, 2032. So that's where it'll be really important for us to all be collaborating on timelines and bookings potentially. I think that's something we could look to in the future, so that if we're getting a vessel coming down to do some installation, we're checking in with you guys and saying, okay, but we'd have to do that well in advance. So yeah, it's a bit of a question mark, that one, but it's exceedingly important question that we should sort of collaborate on at some stage in the future. Yeah.
Excellent. Look, I'm going to draw a line at that because we are 50 seconds away from finishing. Thank you very much, Rudi, Jason, Andre and Joy, for your time and for sharing your presentations. Thank you everybody for coming along, listening. David for making an unsolicited bid there. the artwork will be delivered once your check clears. We have drinks on our stand in quarter of an hour's time, so if you want to hang around, chat to our panellists, and then come and have a glass of something with us, then please do so. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you very much.